Hey, before the video starts, I would like to say that we've passed 1,000 subscribers. Thanks for that. In my Nintendo 64 vs PlayStation 1 video, I tried to hammer some points home that caused a bit of controversy. Specifically, I wanted to compare systems that were already agreed upon as good, just to see which one's better, for fun. As the Saturn was a bit too much of a wild card, I wanted to cover it in a separate, smaller video, and the main video focused on the two far more popular systems, as far more people would compare those two. Of course, the main point I was trying to make was that while the Nintendo 64 had some very good games on it, the PlayStation had them as well. Just far more of them. Because of that, in my comments, I've often seen people claim that I was a PlayStation fanboy. Their reasons for these were, well, there were a few of them, and I would like to go through a couple of them. And I will also explain to you why they're incorrect. First of all, people are mad because I said the Nintendo 64 controller sucked. I'm sorry, but there are many people who genuinely love the Nintendo 64 over the PlayStation 1, and even those people can agree it sucked. Next up, I said that while the slow disk speed could be worked around on the PlayStation, the cartridges had an unfixable flaw, that being their low storage space. This is also just correct. This is why a lot of RPGs just didn't come to the system. And finally, instead of arguing if one game is better than another game, I just compared the amount of Nintendo 64 games considered good and the amount of PlayStation games considered good to see which console had more good games and what genre those good games were in. This is because I felt it was far easier to argue that than to split hairs over if one game is better than another game, because very often that is down to taste. Of course, a select few commenters really didn't like that. They claimed that I made a Nintendo hate piece, as I forgot to talk about the shining masterpieces on the Nintendo 64. They mentioned quantity over quality, and I mean, as they themselves couldn't name more than 3 PlayStation 1 games, they then just decided that the Nintendo 64 must have had far more games worth playing, because if it didn't, they would have surely remembered more of them. Of course, my main intention was to bring up how many PlayStation 1 games are worth playing, and therefore interest more people in them. But no, they claimed that all of the 5th generation games worth playing were on Nintendo, and that's just not the case. Oh, and some people also claimed that the PS1 sold more due to piracy, and let's quickly go over that. Piracy was rampant on the PlayStation 1, but even so, the PlayStation 1 sold 102 million systems and 960 million legitimately purchased games. That is roughly 9.4 games per system. The Nintendo 64 sold 33 million systems and 225 legitimately purchased games, or 6.8 games per system. So even with piracy, the system sold more games proportionally to the Nintendo 64. Of course, far more comments were civil and actually very interesting to read. And the angry fanboys were just a minority. Both in my comments and online, many of the people have claimed that some of the best games of the 90s were Nintendo games. Ocarina of Time and Mario 64 come to mind first. Some people also claim that these games are better than everything else made since. And I'm sorry, but this second particular statement is just not correct. So let's talk about the grossly overstated value of some Nintendo 64 games. Oh, and maybe hear me out first, and then write a comment. So, a big thing we need to talk about really quickly is something being revolutionary. The brick phone was revolutionary. That doesn't mean it's any good today. I'm approaching this from a modern perspective, as I feel it's kind of unfair to say that something is good just because it was good when it came out, regardless of how it's aged today. And in a similar light, I also think it's unfair to claim that something was shit and completely ignore what it meant when it came out. This is also why I think the brick phone still deserves a mention as the first phone, but you shouldn't claim that, you know, it was revolutionary and the best thing it made. And one last thing, I won't talk about how the games look to their frame rates that much, as a lot of the time, which you prefer is down to taste, and most 5th gen games struggle to hit 30 or even 20 FPS sometimes. So has Mario 64 aged poorly? Well, from a modern perspective, Mario handled like a steel ball bearing. The physics range between tolerable and awful, the camera is horrendous, the level design ranges from decent to despicable, finding some stars is extremely annoying, and if you're trying to 120 star the game, you'll notice how much filler the game has. In Bomb Battlefield, for instance, 2 stars require you to just go to the summit, with 2 more stars requiring you to just go to the island. You basically have to do 90% of the same star twice. This is even worse on harder levels like Tick-Tock Clock or Rainbow Ride, where you need to platform up the same really difficult and annoying level several times, just to take a slight detour at the end. And, of course, not all the stars are required, and you don't need to really do them in order. This isn't Sunshine, thankfully. Though, back in 1996, this game did 3 really big things. First of all, it was one of the first 3D platformers with worlds that weren't that linear. I mean, yeah, Crash had branching paths, and you could get collectibles by the end of the level if you broke all the crates. And games like Jumping Flash let you gather all the items in a stage before you could exit it. But Mario 64 was one of the first ones where the levels weren't linear. You didn't need to progress in a set order, you can basically do them however you'd like. If one level is too hard, you can go to another one. The second thing it did is it basically created the collectathon genre of games. Previously in games like Crash Bandicoot, you would have side collectibles that you could use to get a secret ending, but they were not a requirement for progression. Mario 64 made collectibles a currency that you would use to progress the game. It also promoted level reuse. Whereas previous games were often linear with maybe a secret exit area, this helped to interest players in level exploration and maximize how much of your level would be used by players. Because of the loss factor, many people like to dismiss the more 3D linear platformers like Crash as 2.75D. Now, excuse me, but what the fuck is 0.75 of a z-axis? Obviously, 3D platformers have nothing to do with linearity or non-linearity. They have everything to do with how many directions you can move in, and they're 3D games. Mario Galaxy 2 has 2D segments, and it's still a 3D platformer, but of course, that didn't come out a little before Mario 64, so there's no reason for fanboys to argue that it's not really 3D. Let's deal with Ocarina of Time. Has the game aged well? As one comment I saw put it, yes, it's aged well. Well, except for the visuals, the camera, the gameplay, and the entire game, but yeah, it's aged well. Ocarina of Time has aged questionably. Of course, there are parts of the game that everyone despises, like the water temple and the limited menus annoying, the slow start of the game puts quite a few people off, and the camera's frustrating, and the world is barren. Though, the game did some big things too. It popularized the idea of auto-targeting enemies in a 3D world. That way, you would always be facing the enemy while fighting them, so it was much easier to focus on just dodging and landing attacks. It also has controls that are rather difficult to get used to, platforming that is hot garbage, the rupee system is dysfunctional, Navi was so annoying it became a meme, the dialogue was so slow and unskippable that it was just really frustrating, the horse riding physics are questionable, and the enemy design and behavior just makes them slow and cumbersome to fight. Now, the camera was better than in Mario 64, and on par with most other 3D action RPGs, meaning that it's tolerable at best. The game also runs at a locked 20 FPS, which isn't quite as dreadful as you would expect, but bordering on it, because it's pretty stable. Though for me personally, I don't find it that big of a deal when 90s era games run at 15 or 20 FPS, because the low fidelity graphics just kinda fit with the frame rate, kinda like stop motion, while something like GTA 5 and Minecraft running at 20 FPS is just unplayable. But that's just me. Even so, Mario 64 is one of the best games released in 1996, and Ocarina of Time is one of the best games released in 1998. You didn't expect me to say that, did you? Well, you see, different games age in different ways. Many late 2D platformers have aged better than a lot of early 3D ones, because the mechanics were just far more established. A lot of JRPGs have aged relatively well, because they mostly adapted gameplay that was already in a top-down 2D style into a fully 3D one. The main critiques of many 5th-gen JRPGs was how they had these cinematic effects that slowed down the game pacing, along with the annoying grinding and enemy encounters, but these were already established franchises, and far more fleshed out than the new genre that was spawned in this generation, so the flashy effects were there to show off the new graphical power of these 5th-gen systems, even if that did slow the game pacing down a lot. Oh, and something else that I need to really point out. Within the 90s, basically every year brought some kind of massive advancement in terms of game design and graphical capabilities. Compare an early PS1 game to a mid-gen PS1 game to a late PS1 game. Games evolved yearly, even sometimes monthly, and even if the games weren't as revolutionary or notable as their previous entries, they were often easy to get into because of their more polished core, as they could learn from the mistakes of the games that came before them. Meanwhile, a lot of the true pioneers, they were on new ground, and they often aged worse as they didn't really have many other games to learn from. Now let's deal with some other Nintendo 64 games. There were many other 3D platformers on the Nintendo 64. The most notable ones have to be Conker's Bad Fur Day, Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie, and Donkey Kong 64. There were a couple more, but these are the biggest ones. Were they any good? Well, yeah, of course. They suffered from a lot of the same early 3D collectathon stuff that Mario 64 suffered from as well, though they did iterate on some stuff by having better controls, a better camera, and similar stuff. While these games are good, they're nowhere near as revolutionary as games like Mario 64. And even though I've seen people claim that these games are better in terms of gameplay than Mario 64, and I'd have to agree, and even if they were a big step up, they kind of lack the name recognition that Mario 64 did. And even if they are better games, they're not talked about as much because they didn't do as much. The two big FPS games on the platform, GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, were quite important for FPS games and consoles. While Doom and Quake and others already existed, these two took place in a far more contemporary setting, versus the futuristic off-world military bases of Doom and Quake. They also popularized split-screen multiplayer FPS gaming, something later games like Halo would perfect, even if games like Quake 2 on the PS1 also had full-player split-screen. Of course, these two games suffered from pretty shoddy controls, uncomfortable movement, bad frame rates, and other issues that also plagued new games, and other issues that often plagued early games in a new genre in the 5th generation, so that's nothing new. Of course, huge PC games like Half-Life came out well before Perfect Dark, and those control and age far better, but just by virtue of being on a platform that had FPS games on it since the early 90s, and because of that, the control scheme of keyboard and mouse could have been perfected far before many developers managed to perfect the sort of D-pad plus stick combo that would have been the ideal control method for many Nintendo 64 games. But of course, a big aspect of the Nintendo 64's library were party games. Super Smash Bros., Mario Party, even GoldenEye. And as big of a factor as this was for some people, I feel like this aspect of the console was overstated for one simple reason. You would think that if this feature was so important, the vast majority of the highly praised games on the Nintendo 64 wouldn't be single-player experiences, and the console wouldn't have been outsold 3-1 by the PlayStation, the comparable king of single-player experiences. A big factor, I think, is that the PlayStation 1's two controller ports and the optional multi-tap didn't really hurt the PlayStation 1 as much as many people believe it did, as it was far more common to only have 1 or 2 players than to have a whole set of 4. Of course, some games like Twisted Metal 3 and 4 or Quake 2 supported 4 players, and some even went up to 8, but even on the Nintendo 64, very few games actually supported 4-player action. Sure, there was Mario Party, Mario Kart, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Super Smash Bros., F-Zero X, along with sports games and turns-based games like Pokemon Stadium, but overall, most of the critically acclaimed library was single-player focused, and even in games like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, the single-player was meant to be the main meat and potatoes of the game, not the multiplayer. Of course, this is at least partially because of children. Nintendo's main audience, children, could play party games together, as when most kids went to see their friends or family, they wouldn't go out and instead would play games at home, so it was nice to have party games that everyone could play together. Meanwhile, the later teens and adults, who were the target demographic of the PlayStation, would often play games in their free time alone, because it was harder to find time to hang out with their friends, and if they did, they'd rather go out or similar, because they could go to a movie theater, bowling alley, bar, or other similar cool 90s things. This was especially because back then, most parents were just not fans of you sitting in your room all day, unlike today, but during those rainy or snowy days where you had no choice but to stay indoors at home, the PlayStation reigned supreme. Of course, this was all because a lot of the PS1's library was geared towards older people than the Nintendo 64 was. Far more older teens and adults owned a PS1 versus the predominantly child Nintendo 64 audience. And because of the high development and publishing costs on the Nintendo 64, PS1 developers could be far more experimental than many Nintendo 64 developers, who had to make sure their games would sell well in order to rake a profit, as they needed to sell more copies to break even than the PlayStation 1 developers. So, if you're wondering why I went through all of those flaws of all of those games, it's because I want to go over something important. I went over it earlier, but none of those games magically got worse over time. They're exactly as they were previously. The difference is that we just have far more refined games nowadays. I mean, it'd be very concerning if gaming hadn't improved for the near 3 decades that have passed since the mid-90s. Of course, a second reason for showing off the flaws of these games would be to show how no game is bulletproof. You can find completely legitimate complaints in basically all games, especially in older ones who try to do something big in order to stand out from the rest. The first games of a genre are often some of the clunkiest in that genre, as they don't have the already proven foundations of other games to base their designs off of. But of course, many people are staring at their monitors confused right now. They never really noticed the jank in the games they played as kids. If some kind of bullshit happens to you when you're playing a game as a kid, you're far more likely to ignore it or just go along with it. As an adult, it frustrates you because you value your time far more. In regards to jank and such, I personally find Doom 1, 2, and 64 very fun. While I heard many people describe them as frustrating and janky, and while I don't see the same issues they're talking about, I understand where they're coming from, as I've had many similar situations with other games where something that was very jank to me just felt completely natural to somebody with more experience. And of course, plenty of jank was also present in all games, no matter the platform. But it's kind of shocking how many people just excuse or ignore the jank of one platform, and then attack another platform having essentially the same amount of jank. So what does all of this mean? Nintendo 64 games aren't particularly special. There were so many revolutionary games during the 5th console generation that the Nintendo ones don't particularly stand out in as many ways many people would think. In a way, the reason why they're still so fondly remembered nowadays by far more people than games like Twisted Metal, Vagrant Story, Wipeout, or Parasite Eve is because they have the name recognition of Mario or Zelda, along with being childhood favorites of many kids at the time. They're still good games, obviously, and if anyone claims that Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time sucked on release, they're either trolling, uneducated, or both. And same goes with PlayStation titles. Of course, your enjoyment of these games, especially today, will drastically differ depending on what you like and how much jank you can tolerate. But you need to understand the difference between you not liking something and that being bad, and the reverse as well. Many people like The Room. I like the voice acting in the original Resident Evil.
What is this?
Wow, what a mansion! Stop it! Don't open that door!
But Chris is...
Now, Jill, can you go?
I'm going with you. Chris is our old partner, you know.
Okay, let me handle this.
Even though I have to admit, it is god-awful. That doesn't stop the game from being one of the first proper survival horror games, and that doesn't stop me from liking it. At the end, all of this is a fight between objectivity and subjectivity. I try to go over the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 as objectively as I could reasonably go, even if an objective review of media is nigh impossible. And here's how I see it. The truth is that both of these systems were good. I mean, clearly. And so was the Saturn. It's just that the PlayStation 1 had a far larger library of games, and therefore a far larger library of good games. And if you prefer one over the other for whatever reason, anything from it being a huge part of your childhood, to it coming to life and attacking a burglar like in that one regular show episode, that's all fine. But don't unfairly shit on System A just because you prefer System B. For several reasons, sure, but the largest one is you're denying yourself an experience you might enjoy. And maybe in this day of AAA, focus-tested 7 out of 10 games with grand, huge spanning open worlds where all you do is climb radio towers, a short, unique and experimental PS1 game may be exactly what scratches that new game itch for you, even if the game itself is 3 decades old.